So, thanks everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm looking at everybody kind of in the room, and it's really good to be among colleagues, friends. So I'm just really happy to be here. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, and I want to spend some time talking more about maybe the geography perspective, since this is a geography colloquium, but I also want to kind of talk about like how I come to the work as well. So, as you know, I'm Mvskoke Creek. I grew up in the Tulsa area, and so kind of where I'm at right now, I'm in Norman, Oklahoma, and this is not original Creek territory, but at one time it was Creek territory. So I'm sort of back where my relatives walked. So it's nice to be back in this space. But I come to this work really because I talk about kind of the hinge in my work being really around the politics of recognition. And that's sort of something that I'm not interested in spending my research time on. Like, I can teach in that, I can teach students how to advocate in that context, but for me, I really operate within maybe, I guess, the informal context, the everyday community, at a scale that is local, but then maybe also converges internationally, regionally, but in some ways you could say they fly under the radar of federal government, even tribal government. So it kind of starts out, and I talk about this in my book, about how I grew up in Sapulpa, and my parents, they were active in the local Creek community, and at one time they were gathering like at a laundromat to sort through what they envisioned for the community. And to me, that's planning. And so I've always sort of been exposed to this and thinking about this notion of planning. And because planning is concerned with the future, it makes sense, this idea of futurity, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But for me, I saw that the community was really nimble. They were sorting things through. They didn't have to sort through bureaucracy. They didn't have to be intimidated by Robert's Rules of Order. And then once there was a brick and mortar building, and once they became a chartered community, and then it's like they were required to become administrators. And maybe they weren't necessarily ready to be administrators, but in order for them to get the resources that they needed from the entities that were going to provide that, then they needed to become administrators, while also holding like, an everyday job, taking care of their families. And that's a pretty big, tall order to fill. And so the way that I come to this work then is really thinking about emancipatory practices and how Indigenous communities are already doing them every day in a multitude of ways. And they have embodied resources, and it's just a matter of recognizing that and enacting that. And so I'm going to go ahead and start now talking a little bit about the book. Let's see. So I start here with the cover. The cover is by Mvskoke Potawatomi artist Daniel McCoy. And again, it's this hinge of, on the left, we have maybe a Mvskoke way of knowing the world, and on the right, a Western maybe ordering of the world. So the name of this painting is Western Chain of Being. And so you can see this hierarchical ordering of cells, plants, animals, humans, angels, the heavens, that sort of thing. There's an ordering of people and flora and fauna, bottom to top. And it's enshrined within a copperhead snake, which is a common snake here in Creekland. And on the left side is is there any way I can turn this little ring off, Maria? Because every time somebody like
Yeah, let me, I
comes to
will,
the room, it like, it's going ding, ding.
yeah, let
Sorry.
me fix that. I'll fix
Okay.
it.
And then on the left side, so could be a Mvskoke way of ordering the world. So you don't necessarily see humans and animals in a hierarchy. You see the sun up here in the upper left-hand side. And so like if we think about ideas of like epistemology, and that's a way of knowing, and methodology is is like the science of finding information out. So this is really rooted in decolonizing methodology. So if we don't understand everything here in this, on this left side, and maybe it's not meant for all of us to understand, maybe it's encoded in ways that you have to be Mvskoke to understand it, and not everybody has access to it. But let's say, like say for community, a decolonizing methodology might be a way of finding out more. And so the data that we find out from convening community, it has a utility or a use, and we enact that towards some end towards the community. So we don't just go and ask questions and find out just because we're curious. Like if we're doing this sort of community planning work, we're asking questions because the data has utility and we're using it towards some kind of end that benefits the community. So the other thing that I wanted to say about this book is that I would say like it can be used in a number of ways, but the primary objective is really to recognize how Indigenous folks are already embodying resources, that there's a multitude of ways that knowledge can present itself, and that there's valid, important, and necessary information that Indigenous communities need to know in order to work towards futurity for their community. So it's that aspect, the concrete aspect of like, if you look at this book and you're a community member, if you don't even read the whole book, read chapter 6, and those are methodologies that you can use in your community to begin to have conversations. And that's really why I wrote this book. I wanted like my aunt, my uncle, my cousins, my relatives, my best friends growing up, whomever, I want people to be able to pick this book up, go to the methodologies, and use them to have community conversations about things that they care about, and begin to create the kind of future that they want. Because I was doing work at Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. I was doing a sense of place workshop, and I asked them, where do you think your community will be in 100 years? And they said, we won't have any land. We won't have anything. We won't have our language. We won't have our land. There'll be white people living in big houses on what was once our land. And so like for me, it's like, okay, if we imagine that to be the trajectory, what do we need to do now to disrupt that? So the methodology part is really like, how do you get at disrupting that then? Because kind of the way of doing a public meeting where you hand somebody a microphone and tell them, you give them their 2 minutes and tell them to come up and speak what they think, like that doesn't work. So that's really why I come to this work too, is like, how do we set platforms to where community folks can express what they care about, whether it's through mapping, etc. But I'll get to that later. So the book is really something that I feel like community can pick up and go to the last chapter and jump in and hit the ground running. The second is like, how do we decolonize our thinking about knowledge? And I think that like, if folks are thinking about decolonizing knowledge, and there are plenty of other scholars that are writing similar kind of tribally based methodologies, like Michelle Jacobs and Yakima Rising, Linda Tui-Highsmith, Sean Wilson, Research and Ceremony. And I think that reading this book in tandem with those authors would really help one think through like that decolonizing aspect. The other piece is probably, it can also probably be read in conversation with like Glenn Coulthard and thinking through politics of recognition, because again, that really is the hinge of what I'm arguing here in my book. And how, I guess, our response, when I say our, I'm talking about Indigenous communities, the ways in which we respond to the politics of recognition actually shapes our communities. So then we are producing, in part, settler geographies, which leads me to another way in which one can use this book, is using it to teach Indigenous geographies and demonstrating settler geographies and demonstrating maybe other options. The other piece I would say is for Mvskoke people is the book can be used for, it's just a point of departure in terms of thinking of a taxonomy of knowledge. So I lay out several forms of knowledge, such as felt knowledge, smelt knowledge, just like the informal, the everyday sort of knowledge. And there's probably a whole range of other types of Mvskoke knowledge, but this is like a point of departure. So I just kind of wanted to say that about the book too, the different ways it could be used. Okay, so the overview, just really quick, because you know, we have people that need lists and they want to know what's coming next. So context and terms, first out, and then I'm going to talk about these Mvskoke methodologies of futurity. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about tools of futurity, and then Indigenous futurity praxis. So let's start with Mvskoke people. So who are the Mvskoke? So the Mvskoke are originally from the southeastern United States. They are from Mississippian people, and Mississippian people took up nearly the entire eastern half of the US. So it's a huge block of people, and Mvskoke people are part of that. Today we have, I can't remember off the top of my head how many communities, but every single one of these dots on here is a chartered community. And so this is where I'm from, is the Sapulpa Tulsa area over here. So this is pretty much like context. And then this is a locator map, and this is an 11 county area that Creek Nation encompasses. So first off, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about futurity. So what is futurity? Futurity grapples with past, present, and future. Futurity grapples with past, present, and future. And in terms of the past aspect, you can think of it as maybe we're grappling with the unactivated possibilities of our ancestors. So an example of that might be is that, so with removal, and Creek folks were quickly removed to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, and that was very disruptive to our communities. And like maybe, so whenever we do stomp dance, women wear shells, and today it's hard to find people that know how to make the shell shakers that we wear. And so like if we think about the unactivated possibilities of our ancestors, it may be that we had folks that, plenty of knowledge keepers that knew how to make these shell shakers in the community, but maybe that was cut short with this trauma of removal, and their possibilities of teaching that are unactivated. So then if we're doing planning, how is it that we can pick up that baton and activate the possibilities of having more people that know how to shake or make shell shakers, that know how to shake shells, etc. And there's that aspect of it. It can be other forms like I think that's maybe sitting with communities and thinking on that, like maybe more people growing traditional corn and having that at our green corn ceremonies. Maybe that's an unactivated possibility of our ancestors. The second is present, living out the future we wish for in a contemporary moment. So what does that look like? And all this is sort of in conversation, because whenever we're in a present moment, we're always sandwiched between past and present at any given moment. So living out the future that we wish for in a contemporary moment. How can we begin to create what we want right now? Because with planning, sort of one of the things, the issues I have with planning is that people, they sit, they sort things out, they imagine, they dream, but it's long range and sometimes it's out of touch. So it's like they plan, and then we tell them not yet. So how is it that maybe there is some not yet in there, which is the next thing, the future temporality, but the present temporality, how can we build in some very short-term like goals right now that starts to enact the sort of future that we wish for right now, so that it's not like not yet, not yet. And then third and finally is the future aspect. So it's creating the conditions for our relatives that are going to exist in a future temporality, so that they have what they need in the community. And by community and needing, like, so I did a survey with community, and one of the things that I asked was, how is community successful? How is community failing? And a lot of the things that people said were around success. It wasn't around wealth, it was around social relations. So how do you create something maybe either informally or institutionalized within the tribe that engenders these social relations that folks seek out? So whatever that looks like. Maybe it's more softball tournaments, maybe it's language programs, skate parks, etc. That's really where you meeting with folks and doing the planning aspect. So that's sort of how I lay out futurity. I mean, like, I talk about it more at length in the introduction. So in terms of spatializing futurity, what I have here is that Indigenous spatialities are needed because Western spatialities are not complex enough to imagine and carry out Indigenous futurities. So I use a lot of spatial language, in part because I'm a geographer. And so like this idea of spatializing futurity is important because the way that community manifests for us, for creeks, it manifests in different ways. And so one other kind of concept I'm going to bring up here is this idea of kin space time. So often when we're hearing narratives about our communities, they privilege time and space. And these narratives about our communities, our historical narratives, are what I call necrochronologies. So they're really about like damaged narratives, and just it's never something positive. Like if you look back at historical narratives, it's always some sort of damage, and like it's never like folks, I won't say never, but you don't hear as many narratives of folks being victorious, except maybe with the Supreme Court case that we recently won. But that's just sort of like the time space aspect. It privileges these different moments. A kin space time sort of concept privileges social relations and kin. So a kin space time envelope are these different, what I call kin space time, like maybe connecting you to relatives. So if we're thinking of futurity and you're at a ceremony or you're at a stomp dance and you're looking at the Milky Way, you know that your past, present, and your future relatives will see this, and that and maybe the constellations that go with that time of year, they're going to see that same sky. And that is sort of like a kin space-time envelope because your relatives are being connected. Or it could be, well, I'll show you in the next slide, but it gives primacy to kin and relationships to kin, past, present, and future. So this is a piece of work. It's called Mississippian Black Metal Girl on a Friday Night. And the artist is Mvskoke and has sort of taken these, it's the invocation of a Mississippian time-space envelope. So kind of the warrior markings are more stylized in a contemporary moment. And if you look at some of the Mississippian artwork and material culture, you'll see some of these markings, but you can see that it's being enacted in a contemporary moment. And Mississippian Black Metal Girl then is embodying a kin space time envelope of their relatives. And by the way, this is actually a portrait of my daughter who did this. It's Hadogaji, but I just kind of wanted to throw that out there because, you know, when you're with your family and you're sorting through kin space time together, and it's kind of neat to throw this work up there and look at it. So Mvskoke methodologies of futurity. So in the past, when I've done a book talk, I usually like go through each one of these kind of methodologies and talk about them. But for today, I'm going to focus in on emergence geographies. And so, excuse me, one of the things about each of these sort of icons is these are from Mississippian people. And these are block prints that I made. But so the thing about it, like if you have felt knowledge and lived experience informing your practice, that's sort of what's happening here. So when I was making these and kind of the iterations of lines, and sort of one of the things that it kind of reminded me of is stomp dance and how it goes counterclockwise in a spiral, and just like the lines and being in movement. And so for example, this first one is what I call radical sovereignty or Stajati sovereignty. And really that's just a different notion of sovereignty. Maria, are you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Is that my thing doing that, or is that yours?
Yeah, I think that's you because it's not on this end.
Okay, I don't know what's going on. There's all kinds of, I'm sorry guys, there's all kinds of like little beeping going on.
It is the Zoom apocalypse.
It is. I'm trying to like keep my focus with beeps going on. Okay, so radical sovereignty, or what I call Stajati sovereignty. And the reason I call it Stajati sovereignty, so sovereignty, we can think of it like in a fluid kind of way. And again, it's this refusal of the politics of recognition. Okay. I'm sorry, this is like really stuff beeping. Okay. So radical sovereignty. So if the prevailing kind of sovereignty that tribes are seeking, it's like the settler government is making the rules on which like we're operating. But tribes have always enacted sovereignty. It's been built in relationality. It's been built in anogechka, which is love, and like that sort of kinship and taking care of one another, and kinship that is with flora and fauna, etc. And so this symbol is really about this unsort of broken energy. And so that's something that we bring to participatory work too. which is a little bit harder to sense energy on Zoom. But, you know, when you go to a meeting, you can sense folks' energy. You can tell if it's tense. You can tell if people are like holding back or wanting to step forward, or they have something to say. That's sort of like this notion of energy, which is one of, that's sort of a Creek tenet or a Mvskoke tenet for being in the world, that all exchanges between entities, people, flora, fauna, spirits, they're all exchanges of energy. And so this symbol really is like about this unbroken notion of energy. And so community knowledge, again, I'm just going to breeze through the rest of these. But oh, the first one, the reason I call it Stajati is because that's a way of like I always say, okay, like if you're in, say Tulsa and you see another Mvskoke person that you know, Stajati translates to like maybe saying, like, it translates exactly to red man, but what it means is like, you can use it like homie, like, hey Stajati, what's up? Like when you see another Mvskoke person. Or maybe you're in Tulsa and you see another like Indigenous person and they're like, you know that they're not Creek, maybe they're like Pawnee or Osage or something, and then you're with your family or friends and then you'll go, hey look, Stajatis. So it's like a way of recognizing each other, saying Stajati. So that's why I call it Stajati sovereignty. And then the rest of these are really like grounded in community knowledge. The next one is like a different notion of power, of bringing folks together. But today I'm really, again, focusing on emergence geographies. So I start with this piece. At the beginning of creation, there was a great fog that obscured everything. It blocked the people from finding one another. Mvskoke people emerged from the fog to find their kin and form groups. So this symbol, what I really have, it's got 4 directions, but it's really tied to the way some Indigenous peoples track their sun movements. So if you've ever been like to the equator, like the real equator in Ecuador, they have something that lays this out that has to do with like the different movements of the sun during the equinox and all that jazz. So this is really this notion of puncturing something, an emergence. So that's sort of the symbol that stands in for emergence. So the thing about emergence geographies is that Mvskoke people have always had to reemerge. So they emerged from the fog. Again, this is theory grounded in the lived experience of Mvskoke people. And Leanne Simpson talks about theory and she calls it it's just a way of understanding things in the world. So if we understand emergence as we continually create communities, oh, okay, sorry. I keep having this window pop up and when I click it off, it like goes to the next slide. Okay, so can you hear that, Maria?
Yeah, I can hear it. Can you maybe check your keyboard and make sure nothing's like pushing down or anything like weird like that?
Okay, my keyboard is right here by itself, but okay, let's see. Okay, back to emergence geographies. So we have emerged from fog and found each other. We have lived in the Southeast across Alabama and Georgia. We were pushed into Alabama. We reemerged in tribal towns. We were pushed to Oklahoma. We reemerged in communities, and federal Indian policy after federal Indian policy, we have reemerged. Boarding schools, kids getting sent to boarding schools, we still reemerged. We had the relocation period and policy where tribal folks were sent out to urban areas. Even folks in urban areas figured out a way to reemerge. And so from sort of like the lived and felt experience of Mvskoke people, I have this sort of point of departure taxonomy of geographies. And the reason why this is important for the work that I do is that the fixed community, the fixed in space community is not necessarily gonna work for how to plan a community, because the way that Creek Nation or Mvskoke Nation and Mvskoke communities, I know that we just had our Supreme Court ruling about reservation, but the way that land operates in Oklahoma, it doesn't operate like reservations in other places. So the tribe actually has, so it's an 11 county area, but really the tribe owns a checkerboard portion of that land. And so you have to think in different spatial terms, and like, oh, here's a bounded area where the Indians live. It doesn't really work that way in Oklahoma. Or with Creek people, how they've had to reemerge in urban areas, so, and online. So for how I'm thinking about things and with planning, these are the taxonomies that I came up with. So, and for Mvskoke folks, I am happy for them to build on this, to shoot it down. Like, I would like to see us build something collectively around this. So for a concrete geography, this is actually our tribal complex, our headquarters in Oldmoggy, Oklahoma. And this is a mound building, or a mound building. So we are actually from mound builders in the Southeast, and this is sort of like a nod to that culture. And on the top, you have the different animals for our clans, and you come in here, and in the center are our tribal council chambers. So it kind of goes underground. And if you've ever been to Oldmoggy National Monument in Macon, Georgia, there's something called Earth Lodge. You can go in there, and it's like a mound, but it's an entire, it looks like a council area, and there's seating all the way around. So this is sort of a nod to the ways in which we planned our communities and did our governance. So the center of our governance is still within a mound. And this is fixed, it's in place, it's a concrete geography, and you could argue it's a kin space time envelope that is enacting the space and time that our relatives enacted hundreds of years ago in Georgia in the Earth Mound. Let me see. Next is ephemeral geography. So I want to play a little of this for you. Can you hear it? Okay, I just want you to be able to hear a little bit of the way our songs sound and what our dances look like. And I would call this an ephemeral geography, because the way that our dances work is maybe, well, with this was at the festival. We have an annual festival, which is also where I conducted my survey that I cover in the book. And this is definitely something with folks from different communities all over the 11 county area coming together and assembling in a moment and then disassembling. So it's like this ephemeral geography. And for this, it's not like a ceremonial ground. This is more of a social dance that they're doing. And our social dances, well, some of our social dances also happen in the winter, these dances are more for the summer because it goes with like corn harvest and that sort of thing. But the social dances operate as like these ephemeral geographies. They may be like at a gym in the winter, or a community center, or like with this, it's at a festival. And then, but our ceremonial ones, they have concrete places, but you also have this geography that's happening that you have, I couldn't even name the number of, we call them stomp grounds, the number of stomp grounds that we have across our 11 county area. But when people have their dances, people from other grounds come and dance and try to help them out so that they have like a big, huge spiral and they have a big dance. And so every round, every time they come out and do a dance, it's called a round. And every round, they try to find a new leader to come and lead that. You heard like a call and response. So there's a leader that will kind of, he'll be like, yo, hey, you, and then the call is, hey, ha, hey, ha, hey, ha, 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 ha. And there's like this call and response that goes on. And I just disrupted gender expectations because just the men are supposed to sing those songs. But my grandma said she always used to sing the songs when she was dancing. So I was just doing a little bit of disruption there. So you have different leaders coming from different grounds, from different families, from different communities. And so every time that spiral forms, that's a unique geography within itself. That, yeah, so, I mean, yeah. So another maybe urban aspect might be an indigenous skate crew, like I think of Douglas Miles and Apache Skateboard, and he's got like a skateboard team. But this idea of an indigenous skateboard crew assembling and disassembling, or like if you look at Albuquerque during Gathering of Nations, and there's all kinds of side events going on, like the All Nations Skate Jam that Vans puts on. That's another sort of like assembling and disassembling of all these different nations represented through skateboarding. And that could be argued that it's an ephemeral geography as well. They also have what else? Skateboard, softball, basketball tournaments, pool tournaments going on during that time. Those are these ephemeral intertribal geographies as well. But this is an intratribal geography. Another ephemeral intratribal geography, I would argue, are softball tournaments within Creek Nation. And softball tournaments really function as a way of assembling people and exchange and transfer of information. And that's where everything gets sorted through. It doesn't get sorted through within a Robert's Rules of Order meeting. It doesn't get sorted through in a council meeting, Robert Rules of Order type meeting. It gets sorted through in these sort of informal places like softball tournaments or basketball tournaments. So again, it's this necessary social relations. And if you're thinking in terms of like community planning, then how do you resource those sorts of events and ephemeral geographies so that the social relations and the community aspect happens? So you can think of it too as maybe community development. And then I kind of want to throw this one out there too, again, of kin space time. So this is a painting by Star Hardridge. He is Mvskoke, and he's also my cousin. And you can see these different symbols. So if you go back and you think about those symbols that I put together and how each one of those symbols kind of embody a different notion of sovereignty, a different notion of knowledge, a different notion of power and geography, that if you think about the geography of the body being a kin space-time envelope, like I was showing you the one of Hadogaji, this can also operate as a kin space-time envelope because folks are embodying that. So there's a part that I write about in the book, and I'm talking kind of about felt knowledge, and I'm talking about stomp dance. And there's one dance where you hold hands and you kind of move, and like this spiral unfurls, like the leader comes back through and unfurls a spiral. Then they move to another part of the grounds, and then it goes back and spirals back up. And usually the kids at the back of the tail end of it are sort of like going in sort of like a, I don't know, you could call it like a snake-like movement or whatever, like the line. And so they're pulling each other as hard as they can. And so I write about that like we'd be at the tail end and like we're having fun and we're pulling each other as hard as you can. And that even though you fall down and maybe you get hurt and you feel like crying, like everyone's having so much fun and they're happy. And it's the idea of kinship and collectivity and collective power, that you pop back up and you get back into the dance. And so this could be seen as a form of kin space time too, that you're embodying those values and ways of being in the world of your relatives, and that the symbols being on their silhouettes like that. Then I have metaphysical geography. So I can't believe I put this owl on here. Like it really like creeps me out, but like, I'm not sure how much to put forward there, but like from the metaphysical part, like let's say if you've heard of the Howler in Navajo Nation, it's like a spiritual entity that yells at night. So this is something like being cognizant of, is that maybe people don't want a house built over here or a subdivision over here, or this part of the community worked with, because there is a metaphysical aspect. Either there's a sacred component or there is a malevolent kind of component, like if you're thinking about the spiritual realm. So this is a geography, like I think as Indigenous planners, that we must pay attention to. And then the other thing that you can think about the spiritual realm, but you can also think about the celestial realm. So I have like stars too, that like that's a geography, kind of what I was talking about, past, present, and future, and like the stories that are enshrined in that. So I write about in the book, I talk about how it's been said that Mvskoke people believe that we go through these 3 stars, and it's part of the Milky Way. And when we transition from a material form, we pass through that and we return to the source of all energy. And so like sort of understanding that metaphysical aspect too of Mvskoke people. So you can see how it touches down and it produces these different types of geographies. And then finally, our virtual geographies. So with this, we're doing it right now. I mean, I didn't know that it was going to be all this, but so Red Stick Warriors, you can go to their website and you can actually, they teach language online. But Mvskoke people are gathering online, not just Mvskoke people, but you know, Mvskoke people are gathering online in different ways. They've been using Google Groups, listservs, they have Mvskoke Word of the Day on Facebook, but there are virtual ways in which they are gathering together, right? Because 11 counties is a big area. Then you have family living out like how I was living in Albuquerque or Los Angeles, far away from community. So like really having to tap into a virtual geography to have sort of like this sense of belonging. So then some of the things around Mvskoke Tools of Futurity, these are the methods. These are the exact name of the methods in the back of the book. But some of the things that I had for Mvskoke Tools of Futurity, projects of futurity, so like an individual action might be speaking Mvskoke, singing in Mvskoke, practicing shaking shells, beading, sewing, making ball sticks, identifying medicinal plants and making medicine, bow making and shooting, hunting, fishing, growing and canning food, creating new Mvskoke stories, creation of films and literature. one-on-one, the same thing, teaching somebody else these things. For a group setting, teaching language, they're doing something now called the fiddle dance at the Mvskoke Council House. Participating in Mvskoke stomp grounds, attending Mvskoke churches, painting a community-produced mural, and then large kind of intra-tribal, I have playing traditional games. So Mvskoke men's stickball, co-ed stickball, Yuchi Indian football, or that's what they call it. Attending events at Mvskoke Festival, and then global, like, you know, tapping into these larger international social movements through, like, say, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which that's what some of my work was involved with in the past. And then they had a convening of an International Indian Treaty Council meeting in Okemo, which is in Creek territory. So those are some practices that folks are already doing in terms of futurity. They embody those resources, they're carrying them out. These are approaches at the back of the book that I said, chapter 6, like, you know, just go there and Xerox it and spread it out among the community and that'll work. So I want to finish out with an example of Indigenous futurity, an Indigenous futurity praxis of putting the tools in action. And with this, Strong-Hearted Women's Coalition, they work around anti-violence with Indigenous women and children. And so I worked at this. They had a convening. It was all day, probably with about 25 or 30 women. They were together all day, and it started off with collage making. And so the thing about it is that you may not get what you need from doing a survey with folks. So with this, it was an ephemeral geography that was created. These women were from different tribes. The collage making, it was pretty much like, here's a stack of magazines. If something strikes you, don't worry about why, just pull it out and start making a stack. And then they had canvas, and then they started cutting out the pictures and Mod Podging them on the canvas. And that was something, it took an hour. So what I have here, I also talk about time in my book. And so this graph is sort of like talking about the way that time gets bent. So for that felt like it took a while for people to get into the flow of it. And so this line is a little bit longer in thinking about time. And that collage piece, it comes up later and I'll talk about it. The next thing that we did was we gave them a zine that we created. It was like a decolonial Indigenous feminism zine, and it had a beading kit with it. And so after they finished collage making, they were beading and they were listening to different speakers talk about things going on around anti-violence. And so it's this idea that folks aren't just sitting and listening, like, you know, that there's a little bit of activity going on too. So they were beading, and then between probably 11 and 3, they also ate lunch. They ate breakfast together. They made a collage. They beaded. They ate lunch. So they had 2 meals together. And then we looked at the collages. They laid them out on the table, and then they started explaining the collages to each other. Like, oh, I picked that because whatever. And so they started getting a better sense of what they were thinking about their community. So it sort of primed the pump for them to then talk about what they were proud about and what they were sorry about in their community around anti-violence and Indigenous women and children. Some of the things that they said, usually the way that I do that too is they write prouds down on a piece, and maybe they stick it in a bowl. They write sorries down, they stick it in a bowl, and then there's some anonymity, because sometimes people don't feel comfortable outing out their, I don't know, their cousin's husband that didn't come out to a 911 call to their house or something. But those were some of the things that came up, that somebody's relative worked for the tribal police and they wouldn't come out and intervene in some kind of violence going on. But when we got to prouds and sorries, they had a lot to say and it went quick. And you can see like at 3:30, the dialogue piece, the time got really short and it flew by and then we were out of time. But they were starting to think of policy interventions just from this, spending the day with them, a small group, and they were ready to talk about prouds and sorries and come up with policy interventions. And so that's like, when you start using methodologies that match the community and not just like, hey, we're gonna have a public hearing, here's a microphone, come up, you got 3 minutes to tell us what you think. We invested the time to spend a day with them and go through this, and it yielded a lot. So then just a recap of Indigenous futurity praxis. Futurity then is refusing this idea of not yet in planning work. We're gonna do this, we're gonna sort stuff out, but you can't do it yet. I mean, and actually what we did, we could have probably taken their collages and had them write an artist statement, and that could have been a traveling show, and that could have addressed the not yet, really. It invokes many temporalities, past, present, future, and then each of these areas kind of goes into what like radical sovereignty is about relationality, reciprocity, and sort of this community accountability, community knowledge. I've got, you know, I talk a lot about time and different types of community knowledge and how it's generated, and community power, that it being more about caretaking and not about like being over something or in opposition, but it's like, how do we use our collective power to take care of one another? So then that also kind of goes into a conversation about alternative economies. And then finally, what I presented with emergence geography. So you can see how kind of identifying and surfacing Indigenous knowledge and Mvskoke knowledge informs methodology, and then methodology surfaces knowledge and, you know, information that can then inform how to plan a community for past, present, and future. So that is what I have today, and I thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that wonderful presentation and for persisting with the technological challenges. I myself had my computer die, so I've returned on my phone. And I will take questions in the chat that people have for Laura. I've got one already from Jennifer Tucker. So Laura, you ready?
Yep.
All right, Jennifer said, I see so many fundamental epistemological challenges that your work poses to most planning practice and theory, how we conceive of power, what counts as knowledge, how we can meaningfully value life in the natural world. I know your main audiences are Indigenous communities. I'm also curious how much you're interested in challenging the dynamics of settler colonialism within planning practice and theory. Do you see openings for this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Indigenous planning and Indigenous feminisms is that it's not just for Indigenous people. It's actually, there are ways that it can intervene, especially in planning. Like, I don't know, like I just think about definitely the thing about when you convene a meeting and you're going to do a hearing and you have 3 minutes to speak, and like, that's scary to people. I mean, not just Indigenous people, that's scary to everybody, that you have to like have like this really concise argument that you're going to go up and articulate in front of all these people, and maybe you're not an expert, but you have to pretend to be an expert. Like, I think that definitely like the participatory methods aspect can address that. I also think like the different spatialities too of thinking how folks move through space. So I didn't really get into it here, but I think I get into it more with my missing and murdered Indigenous women work, and like this idea of movement through space and folks' perception of risk, or how it is that there are obstructions to movement through space. And I think that that's something for Black, brown folks, anybody that feels like they're marginalized, folks with disabilities, and thinking how folks move through space. To what degree are they able to move through space unfettered? Like whether it's through police surveillance that you can't move through space, or surveillance by a perpetrator that wants to do something to you, or that nobody cared to think about the physical design of a space is difficult for a disabled person. So I can see how like thinking that through of moving through space and thinking of new spatialities in planning can inform mainstream planning. I think the other thing too is probably around like, well, I don't really talk about it here either, but it's sort of like newer work that I'm thinking on, but an Indigenous feminist planning praxis and like the idea of refusal. So like folks, and that comes from Audra Simpson's work, that you don't have to open up your whole community and answer like all the questions a planner has. You only have to give them what they need to know. And so I think that maybe planning folks understanding that and recognizing them, don't come in and think that you can start quizzing down community. Like you don't have a rapport, you're not going to be around, like people don't want to give you information. So it's almost like I could see how folks could see planners like extractive researchers in the same way. And people have research fatigue, right? And they probably have planning fatigue, not just like Indigenous communities. So I could see how like what I talk about in my book about helicopter researchers dropping in and flying out, that there are probably helicopter planners that drop in and fly out, and there's not an ongoing relationship with Indigenous communities, Black communities, communities of color, sexual minority communities. So does that help, or did you have anything else on that, Jennifer? Okay, thanks.
So we've got actually a bunch of questions in here. I want to let people know that we are recording this, so it'll be available later up on our UNM Geography and Environmental Studies website. So Laura's able to stick around, so I'm going to just go on to the next question here. This is from Brian Hudson. He said, I really enjoyed the tribally specific theories about the future that you develop in your book. What do you think the role of Indigenous futuristic fiction might be in building community?
Yeah, that's, I think that it's really cool because it doesn't bound our ideas, because when we sit in a community, it's like, oh, we can't do that. But like, Indigenous futurisms and fictions actually lets us imagine the communities that we want to be in. So like you could write a nonfiction story about decarceral worlds, right? Like we can't even imagine that right now, what it would look like. But like a fiction writer can imagine that. Like I think of, what's that book about Marrow? Brian, do you know which one I'm talking about? That Sherry DeMello writes. Are you still here?
The Marrow Thieves?
Yeah, the Marrow Thieves. Yeah. So like when I think about the Marrow Thieves and how they actually formed community in that little group, and it's like this really apocalyptic time for them, and they're actively being hunted, and then they get to this place where like folks are caretaking one another, and like that spatial imaginary of social relations is beautiful. Like we can't even imagine that right now. But I think that like fiction can help us imagine the kind of Indigenous futurisms fiction that you're alluding to, can help us imagine these places that we would like to see, but because of like bureaucracy, it's like sometimes you can't even brainstorm. People are like, you can't do that. You can't put those speed bumps there. I mean, you know, we're stuck even like whatever, like thinking about speed bumps and where they can go. let alone imagining like this spatial imaginary of beautiful kinship and caretaking. So I hope that answers your question.
All right, here's one that is just more of a comment from Roald Kern saying, I think it would be interesting to map the larger spiral of where people come from to meet at gatherings and dances from different counties and even around the country and beyond.
Okay, what is it? Yeah, that, when I was rereading some of that stuff that I wrote, I think I wrote it in chapter 5, just about the spiral and how many folks are represented at these grounds. And like, I think that it would be really empowering to see that folks are driving from miles and miles and they come, and our dances pretty much go from a few hours after the sun goes down until the sun goes up. We dance all night. Yeah. So like for me, seeing how folks are coming together, yeah, that would be really cool. The other thing that is kind of interesting would be, that I've thought about, is mapping tribal games, where they're played, which ones are like more like social games and where they're played, which ones are more like the medicine games that are played. And then like I know that some of the tribes, Choctaw, Chickasaw, they have teams that go, and there's like a big like championship sort of tournament in what is it, in Choctaw land in Mississippi. But yeah, anyway, thanks for that suggestion or idea.
So let's do a couple more here. Here's one from Camilio Calabasa. He said, can you talk more about the idiom you mentioned on page 96 in your book, quote, having one's voice heard, end quote, being problematic?
Sure, I can talk about that. So my scholar activist elders talk about voice, that when you say make people's voice heard, that there's a way in which that objectifies people into a voice. They're no longer someone that has a set of concerns, that maybe I don't have adequate water, or the road infrastructure isn't good enough for me to get to the hospital in an adequate amount of time. That it reduces and collapses people's concerns and issues to a voice. And that when you go and like maybe you're representing your community and you're saying like, the way that it's sort of like, here comes so-and-so, here comes Laura and her voices. It's not, here comes Laura and the concerns of the community, which are around water, like if we think of COVID-19 and right now, like say Navajo Nation, and having adequate water supplies, being able to not get blocked out of Gallup to come in and get resources, the racism in border towns, it collapses that into an object that's a voice. So that's what I'm talking about when I say one's voice heard being problematic.
Great, okay. Let's do one more here. I'm just running through this. From Paulina, do you have recommendations for incorporating these sort of methods in teaching to introduce students into the variety of ways we can approach research in geography and related fields?
Yeah, actually the way that I structure my classes is the first half we may have discussion, and in the second half we actually do these. And when I teach my methodology classes, they actually take these methods and carry them out. So like I see one of my former students in here, Javier, and he was in my participatory methods class. And so it's like taking a method, they practice it in class, they take it to their family or whomever, they try it out so that you're not like bungling it with your own, with the community or something. You bungle it with like your wife or your partner or your kid or your classmate, and then you bring it back and you sort it through. So like say, actually the methods from the book, maybe one of the first things I might do in class are prouds and sorries, or like if students are concerned about an issue going on, like, you know, I know that after our current president was elected, our class was really like depressed. And so I did this thing of like prouds and sorries, like kind of what are you proud about in this moment and what are you sorry about in this moment. And that really helped them to sort through what they were grappling with in the moment. And they talked about it and we had a really awesome conversation. But you know, I think the prouds and sorries is a really good go-to to use in class. I've also used the zine one in class in thinking about futurity. And I think I see another student in here that worked on that, if they're still here, but that was Sarah Twist. And we did it around 7 generations. Like if you sent a time capsule 7 generations into the future, what would you want to be in it? And I remember specifically some of the stuff that she put was like making sure we make sure you learn your songs and kind of like these teachings from her Native women elders. So yeah, definitely. I mean, I think any of the methods in the book can actually be used in class, especially if there's like an issue to grapple with, or if you just want to build community. It's really about building community, right? So it's not just about the end product of you have a community plan, but it's the process of carrying out these methods that you're building relationships with one another. And so that's why when I talk about the where I am from, which that comes from my friend and colleague, New Mexico poet laureate Levi Romero, when you do a where I am from poem, you are really like revealing yourself. You're putting all your cards on the table. So when you do something like that with a class or a community, it is absolutely rapport building. But I think something like that, it's good to have a little bit of a rapport before you do that. But yeah, so that's my answer on that.
Well, thank you, Laura, for all these insights. There's actually a number of more questions in the chat, but I think we probably better wrap it up. I know that you have a class that you have to get to. I just want to say on behalf of UNM and NMSU Geography, thank you so much for being with us and for kicking off our fall series with this great presentation.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's good to see new faces and old faces, and yeah.
You're getting a bunch of chat thank yous.
Oh, okay, awesome. Is there any way to save the chat stuff so I can like look at the questions?
Yeah, we can save the chat, and then we've done the recording. And Chris Brown, if you can stay on with me until we can sort out wrapping up the call, that would be great. But yeah, Laura, we will send you the chat, and I'll let you know when we get the recording posted so you can refer people to it.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thanks.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
And if my class is still here, I'll see you guys in like 10 minutes. All right. See ya.
Bye, Laura.